So hello everybody, and welcome to this NABCA webinar. It is titled Unraveling the Mystery of U.S. Alcohol Regulation. Before I introduce our speaker, Pam Erickson, I wanted to address a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is one of a series of several planned through 2019, and this webinar that we have planned in the future will be with Dr. Aaron White of the National Institute of Health. That is scheduled for April. There is also one being planned for September with the TTB. So now back to today's webinar. It will be about 1 hour. If you have questions, please type it in the chat window in the lower right corner of the screen. And at the end of the presentation, I will come back and ask questions for Pam to answer. The presentation is being recorded and will be available through the nabca.org website within 7 to 10 business days. You will find it under the Resources tab. So now I would like to introduce Pam Erickson. Pam is a passionate leader on alcohol issues. She currently owns Public Action Management, which operates an education campaign for a healthy alcohol marketplace. From 1996 to 2003, she directed the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, which included operating Oregon's distilled spirits business. From 2003 to 2007, she worked at Oregon Partnership to direct statewide leadership and media campaigns to reduce underage drinking. Her education campaign is designed to explain the purpose and objectives of alcohol regulation in simple terms. She has developed several reports on deregulation in the United Kingdom and the US, and biennially produces a report for policymakers called Issue Briefs. These reports explain how deregulation can lead to increased social problems such as high rates of underage drinking, public order offenses, and alcohol-related diseases. Recently, she launched a series of short reports. The latest one is entitled Special Rules for Small Breweries, Wineries, and Distilleries. Pam also served as an expert witness in key alcohol regulation cases in Kentucky and California. Her educational materials are available at healthyalcoholmarket.com. And please note that everything in the web address is spelled out, Healthy Alcohol Market, and then the .com. So Pam, I now turn the webinar over to you, and hopefully everyone can see her screen. And again, feel free to type in any questions on the chat window or in the question box. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maggie, and it's a pleasure to present this webinar to all of you. And I'm gonna skip to the introduction. We've entitled it Unraveling the Mystery of U.S. Alcohol Regulation. Before I became a regulator, I didn't know anything about alcohol regulation. I had a lot of experience in the public sector, but I really didn't know anything about alcohol regulation. And I probably had the same kind of attitude as our public does. First of all, you need to understand that, generally speaking, according to surveys, alcohol regulation enjoys a substantial amount of support from the public. The public really understands that alcohol creates a lot of social problems and that regulation is very important. But they don't necessarily understand individual alcohol regulations, and sometimes some of them sound kind of odd to us. So I realized when I was an alcohol regulator that we need an educational program for explaining these things to people. Why do we regulate the way we do? Why do we have control systems and license systems? And what is this three-tier system? Well, our history really holds a lot of those answers. So I'm going to go back and trace our history for you and show how problems developed, and then after Prohibition, what happened to try to quell those problems. And the reason we do this is this is a great quote from George Santayana. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And we definitely don't want to repeat the conditions that we had before Prohibition, where there was no regulation, or during Prohibition, where it was a complete ban. So we don't want to repeat our past. So let me talk a little bit about our history. The first wave of immigrants to our country came from Europe. Europe was and still is the heaviest drinking region in the world. When I was a regulator, I often got this question that, why can't we be more like Europe? They have fewer regulations and fewer problems. Well, that's completely untrue. They have substantial social problems, and many of the countries in Europe have been making an effort over the past couple of decades to reduce consumption and reduce problems. But they did bring their heavy drinking habits and some of their products over to America. Alcohol consumption was very, very high, more than twice what it is today, according to historians. And part of the problem was that there weren't a lot of safe things to drink. Water wasn't really safe. It had sediment and various toxins in it, so it wasn't particularly safe. Even milk was questionable, depending on what the cow ate. If the cow ate a lot of milkweed, it could kill children and poison adults. So there weren't a lot of things to drink, and people actually thought that alcohol was healthy and maybe even good for you. Workers in shops and factories and such places often had 2 breaks a day for the purpose of taking some alcohol, one at 11, one at 4. And usually the alcohol was in the form of hard liquor because that was the most popular drink early on. Alcohol also was often an incentive to get elected. Many of you have read about states that have eliminated their law that bans sales during election day. Well, this was the reason that various candidates would give liquor to potential voters, and if they would vote for them. And actually, George Washington allegedly lost an election because he didn't provide alcohol. He refused to do that and lost the election. So the next time around, he provided the alcohol to prospective voters. So that's our early history. I like this slide and this map because it really shows where heavy consumption of alcohol is. We talked about how in Europe, Europe always has been and continues to this day to be the heaviest drinking region in the world. And so you can see that illustrated on this map. We have quelled some of our drinking habits and don't drink as high as some of the countries in Europe. Also during our history, alcohol was an important commodity for the economy. And we're in that kind of situation today with all of our micro breweries, wineries, and distilleries, and alcohol tourism, all kinds of ways to interest people in spending their money on alcohol. And a good example from our history is that in the early days, there was a surplus of corn west of the Appalachian Mountains. And there was no way to transport it to the heavy population areas of the East Coast. There were no good waterways, the roads were kind of bad, and there were no railroads. But the farmers came up with a solution of making corn whiskey. So that was much easier to transport, and you had a heavy drinking population on the eastern seaboard. And it actually became somewhat patriotic to be a drinker of whiskey, because previously the people drank rum, which was an imported product. So some of these themes we are seeing across our country with regard to micro breweries, distillers, and wineries. But it's just not that unusual. Before Prohibition, there was almost no regulation of alcohol, and that fostered the development of what's called the saloon system. In the 1800s and 1900s, there were waves of German immigrants. They brought their beer and brewing skills and eventually captured the market. The saloon system featured what's called tied houses. 70% of the saloons, which were really the only place to buy alcohol in a given community. Generally speaking, stores did not sell alcohol. You had to go to a saloon to buy it for home consumption, but most of the consumption was at the saloon itself. A saloon owned by a manufacturer required that that saloon only sell their products. So every manufacturer needed to have a tied house saloon in a given community. I grew up in a small town called Astoria on the Oregon coast. And my grandmother had some maps of the town in the late 1800s. And I was shocked to see how many saloons were downtown. This was a small town, less than 10,000 people. And yet the downtown was absolutely littered with saloons. That was true in most of our local communities, where saloons were unregulated, and competition was extremely fierce, using gambling and prostitution and other methods to maximize sales. So in summary, what we had before Prohibition was rare regulation and control of alcohol. Alcohol was very heavily promoted using aggressive sales taxes, gambling, prostitution, and they often located saloons around factories and encouraged workers to come to the saloon after their work, and would even pledge their paycheck if they didn't have any change in their pocket. So by the end of the month, when the pay envelope came around, there wasn't much for the family. Some localities did license saloons, but mostly that was for collecting fees. Eventually, very serious social problems resulted from this situation. This is a quote by a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote a couple of books called Democracy in America. He was a great observer of behavior and went around the country observing, talking to people, and he made this quote: I at last understand that 300,000 Americans, alarmed by the progress of drunkenness around them, had made up their minds to patronize temperance. Now, uh, the argument about alcohol was either a situation of no regulation or prohibition. There really weren't any in-betweens. And there was fierce political discussion about this issue. And the temperance movement grew and grew. It was started by evidence of heavy drinking, severe social problems. And this is an issue where women took a lot of leadership. On your screen, you see a picture of Frances Willard, who headed the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Oftentimes, women involved in the prohibition movement or the temperance movement are looked at as kind of cartoon characters, buzz killers, crazy women. But women had very serious issues. Most of them did not work outside the family and were dependent on their husband to bring home money for the family. But when the bar bill took up most of the money that was to go to the family, that strained family resources. So there were some very serious issues that impacted women and their families. So it's not something that is just a kind of situation of buzzkill or taking an overly moral position on something. There were serious problems that resulted. The temperance movement grew and grew. This is a picture of the 16th convention of the Anti-Saloon League. If you go on to the Library of Congress website, there are a lot of these old pictures that took place during the temperance movement or during Prohibition, and they're very interesting. But the Anti-Saloon League of America became a very skillful lobbying operation. It was one of the first grassroots movements and employed a lot of grassroots lobbying techniques, which survive to this day. And the various states struggled with a way to deal with the problems of alcohol. During the 1900s, there was a great deal of political discussion between wets and dries. Political leaders would align themselves with either the wet or dry movement, even though they may be drinkers themselves. They were part of the dry movement and vice versa. So it was an interesting time. But then World War I began, and there started to be an attitude against German brewers. Americans stopped accepting money from German brewers. And then in 1917, the US entered World War I. Historians now believe that the anti-German sentiment helped move us toward prohibition. And perhaps if there hadn't been the World War or that anti-German sentiment, we might not have gone to full prohibition. But in 1919, the 18th Amendment passed and was ratified. And that gave us a period of 13 years where the entire country was subject to prohibition. Prohibition actually did solve some problems, but it fostered others. It did eliminate the public order issues and reduce social problems because drinking was now underground and not permitted in public or that kind of thing. it really dramatically reduced the public order issues. And it did appear to reduce drinking levels. There's a lot of debate about that, but actually, since it was illegal, no one has very accurate statistics. But I do believe that it reset our relationship with alcohol. And as you will see in the future, we have adopted a moderation principle for alcohol, and that's different from our forebears in Europe. The cons are that alcohol sales and service became part of nationally organized crime syndicates. Illegal retail outlets called speakeasies sprung up to accommodate drinkers. Enforcement of national prohibition was very weak, and some states did very little to enforce the law. Eventually, it became very unpopular and was subsequently repealed. So the 21st Amendment repealed national prohibition, but it also gave states the primary responsibility to regulate alcohol. But states had almost no expertise or experience in alcohol regulation, didn't know how to construct a system that would regulate the product. But a prominent entrepreneur of the day, John D. Rockefeller, financed a large study that resulted in a book called Toward Liquor Control. In this study, they studied all of the systems around the world that controlled alcohol. And they also interviewed over 400 leaders from all walks of American life. And this is what they found. They found that there was a belief among Americans that moderate use of alcohol could be part of civilized living. They also believed that any version of the saloon system must never return. And there is a great quote from Franklin Roosevelt, who was president at the time, that echoed that sentiment. He said that the saloon system, in its present mode or in a modern guise, must never return. So that was one of the recommendations of the study. The system was characterized by aggressive, overstimulated sales and political corruption. So any regulatory scheme needed to address those kinds of issues. The authors of the book recommended a control system because they felt that would really address some of the adverse impacts of the profit motive. But they also realized that many states would go for a license system. And so they made recommendations regarding both systems. So let's talk about the two systems and what they're all about. Under a control system, the state takes ownership of the product at some point in the business cycle, usually the wholesale operation and the retail operation. In Oregon, when I was a regulator, we had the wholesale business, although we used common carriers to actually transport the product to our liquor stores. We used to have state-operated liquor stores, but had converted to a system whereby we contracted with local operators and private operators, kind of like a franchise operation. And that is a system that is in place today. But this system limits some of the adverse impacts of the profit motive. It also generates more revenue that can be applied to the social harm created by alcohol abuse. The license system allows private-owned operators to operate both all segments of the alcohol system: the manufacturer, the distributor, and the retailer. And I would say just 10 years ago, I would say that there are some licensed states that are very tightly controlled, even more so than some control states. But those states have recently been deregulating a lot, and so they no longer have those excellent systems of control. One of those is Indiana, which had a private system of liquor stores that was very tightly controlled, but now the ability to sell all forms of alcohol has been given to big box and convenience stores without a lot of the training requirements and so forth. So it's really loosened control for that particular state. Increases in competition and allowing a lot of promotional and advertising activity often lowers prices and increases consumption in license. And finally, in license, less revenue is available on the whole for problems. All states, both license and control, license everyone that sells or serves alcohol. In most states have extensive background checks for licensees in order to keep the criminal element out of the license business. Those states that have legalized to regulate really illegal out of the business. It takes time and takes a lot of effort.
Pam?
So all states enforce law. Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt,
Hello?
but your sound, can you hear me? Your sound is
Yeah.
your sound is cutting in and out. I just letting you know if it's possible.
Okay. Okay. I think I had a paper in front of me.
Okay.
I was talking about enforcement of laws, and all states enforce laws to reduce underage drinking, excessive drinking, and drunk driving. So all states have enforcement to do those kinds of things. Almost all states also regulate the days and hours of sale and of licensed premises and so forth. All states, to one degree or another, require products to flow through a three-tiered system. And I think the three-tiered system is one of the genius aspects of our alcohol regulatory system, and it has a couple of benefits that are unfortunately poorly recognized. If you read NABCA's daily news today, there is a story about a tainted product, a product that is not a real vodka product that has appeared on retail shelves. Oftentimes, these products contain methanol, which is unfit for human consumption, can cause blindness and death. In the Czech Republic a few years ago, over 30 people died from consuming such products. And they had to cease alcohol sales for several weeks until they were able to locate all of the bottles of this product that was harmful to human beings. We almost never see that product because our distributors are track every bottle that flows through the three-tiered system. We have the three-tier of product sale, products that come from a licensed manufacturer who can to a license who can only sell to retailer by grant privileged small breweries, distilleries, and so we need to watch that to see whether or not it comes. But there have been a couple of recalls lately that concern was bottles chipping the bottle. Those things were quickly pulled from the grocery and convenience store shelves, and no one was harmed because of it. The second major benefit of them is that we have almost 100% excise tax collections. In other countries, potential minimum tax. So we have excellent tax collections and very safe products because of the three-tier system. So let's look at what we have today. We have the shared principles of both license and control systems. We do background checks and other license criminal requirements to keep the criminal element out of the business. The three-tiered system keeps our product safe and collects taxes for us. We prevent sales to minors and curtail excessive drinking by enforcement. We also limit availability. Our prohibition lower saturated with outlets and little or no product for our days of sale. Today we do that.
Pam, I think we're
It's
still
interesting
having
to note that systems around they tend to predominate in northern, where drinking heavier. The United States is a control, but also yes.
I was just saying that I think there's still an audio issue. I don't know where your positioning is, but a lot of folks are having a difficult time hearing. You're cutting in and out.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Okay, I'll keep my face close to the screen. In the U.S., control systems do kind of predominate in regions. Most of them are in the northern areas. Northern countries and northern states tend to have greater consumption of alcohol. And one of the reasons that people often suggest is weather. If it's gloomy all winter long, some people resort to drinking more alcohol. And but we never knew whether that was true or not. Very recently, there is a new study that does find a correlation between adverse weather conditions and alcohol consumption. So that's just an interesting little tidbit for us to know about. But the darkened states are state control systems, but we also have some states where in localities they have a control operation where the local government owns all or part of the alcohol business. So what does research say about control systems? Control systems generate a lot more revenue than licensed systems, about 82 to 90% more than licensed systems, depending on the particular model of the control state. And also about 15% fewer problems. So I think there are two major advantages to control systems. One is certainly revenue. On average, across the country, it's been said that only about 40% of the cost to the public of alcohol harm is covered by taxes and other revenue sources. So the fact that a control system has much more revenue is really a good thing because it means less of a burden on the taxpayer. So revenue is definitely a major issue for control systems and a major benefit. But the other benefit is that control systems can make greater use of what's called the strong strategies. If you look at a book called Alcohol, No Ordinary Commodity, this is a book that has been produced by the world's most renowned alcohol researchers. And it's very, very useful. It has a chart toward the back of the book that lists all of the alcohol regulations, what research says about their efficacy, and then something about the cost. So someone can look at this chart and review what policies you have in your state or local area and what you might want to strengthen or add. So it's very, very helpful. But I want to kind of go through some of the strong strategies and how they can help work. The strong strategies are strategies which impact price, the 4 P's of marketing: price, promotion, product, and place. And price is one of the strongest strategies. Usually people equate price with raising taxes, but in a control system, you set the price. In Oregon, we set our prices pretty high. We were the second highest price on average in the country. The highest was and still is the state of Washington. Price is a strong controller of consumption, and it's been a very, very well-researched aspect of policy. So price is very important. Promotion, which induces sales and can encourage consumption. If you own the liquor stores or the retail outfits, or if you have a contract or a franchise agreement, you can decide what kind of advertising is appropriate for the party that is really selling your products. So that was very helpful. Also, you can keep dangerous products out of the marketplace. Most control jurisdictions accept products into their product list via a listing committee, which reviews presentations and decides whether or not to carry that product in their stores. I remember one listing committee meeting where we had a presentation for Russian roulette vodka. we decided not to list that product. And the reason was we felt it was the wrong message. There were way too many shootings with of intoxicated people. And we simply did not want to encourage anyone to play Russian roulette while drinking vodka. So we decided not to list that product. In the state of Washington, before they deregulated and privatized their system, had a special requirement for Everclear. That is a 90 proof product. They did not put it on their shelves in their stores, and you had to fill out a special form to purchase it. So it provided some additional safeguards. Finally, regulating place. In a control system, you decide where the retail products are sold, either through your franchising or your licensing, and you can limit the hours and days of sale, which research has shown relates to fewer problems. The overall goal is to balance things, balance business needs and public safety concerns. And we need to remember that alcohol causes great harm. 88,000 deaths are attributed annually to alcohol use. Also, it endangers others. We seem to be stuck at 10,000 plus deaths due to drunk driving on our highways, and 290,000 injuries per year. These things cost all of us in terms of increases in insurance, healthcare, local law enforcement, and so forth. And I like to remind people about some personal stories about alcohol abuse. And on this screen is a picture of a friend of mine, Jan Snyder from Minnesota. About 30 years ago, she and her husband were driving to dinner, and they were hit by a drunk driver. He was killed. The drunk driver was killed. And Jan was so badly injured that she required 3 years of 24/7 care. After that, she was able to live somewhat independently for a couple of decades. But now she's in her 70s, and once again, she needs 24/7 care. The cost of that for just one human being is in the millions of dollars. So it is very, very costly to all of us for these kinds of things. So let's talk about some of the takeaways from today. History shapes what we did today, what we have today. Prohibition was an extreme yet unsustainable reaction to severe social issues caused by alcohol. Equally extreme is an unregulated market, which we had before prohibition. So we don't want either of those alternatives. We want a system that encourages moderation, that keeps all of us safe. Power to the states. After Prohibition, the 21st Amendment gave the primary responsibility for alcohol regulations to the states. So they are the primary bodies that regulate alcohol. Certain principles transcend both control and license system. We all license everybody that sells or serves alcohol. We all use some form of the three-tier system, and we all require that license retailers be licensed and control locations, hours, and days of sales. States originally chose either a control or license system, although some states actually stayed in prohibition for several years, but eventually eliminated that option and became licensed states. Only one state has changed from a control state to a licensed state, and that's the state of Washington. The control system has two major benefits. One is much greater revenue to offset social problems. And it's easier to use the strong strategies to control prices, promotions, products, and place for optimal harm reduction. The license system produced substantially less revenue and are less effective at reducing binge drinking according to scientific literature. I wanted to just go over some resources for you because I want to highlight a few things. For a history, I use the work of Bill Rorabaugh, who is an alcohol historian at the University of Washington. And he's recently published a little book. It's about 100 pages called Prohibition. It's a quick read, and I would recommend it to you. I doubt many of you regulators have a lot of time to read dense history books, so that would be an option. A lot of the popular books about prohibition tend to make a little bit of fun of the situation. It's very interesting. I've read almost all of them, and I find them quite interesting, but maybe they don't tell quite the whole story. I would recommend that you at least skim through Toward Liquor Control. It is a bit of a hard read because it's written in language that was used in the 1930s. But it is amazing how those recommendations are still in force today in both license and control states. Also, I highly recommend Alcohol, No Ordinary Commodity. It's an excellent research review, and there is a second edition available. Most alcohol research is one at a time, one policy at a time, but no state or local community has just one regulation. We have a whole system. And Tim Namey and his colleagues have produced some recent research that looks at a whole series of alcohol policies and has recommended that states could review this scale of alcohol policies and beef up its policy environment and prevent more harm. Also, Raymond Zullo has produced information about control state systems and is very useful for control systems. And the Community Prevention Task Force has reviewed credible research and provided recommendations, including a recommendation that no further privatization of control systems take place. So I want to thank you so much for listening. I've really appreciated the opportunity to talk to you, and I'm going to turn it over to Maggie.
Okay, thank you, Pam. I want to thank you for your time. We do have a couple of questions, and if you think of others as I'm asking them, feel free to type them in the chat window, and we will ask Pam the questions and get you your answer. So Pam, one of the questions that I have is, when you are referencing the European immigrants, are you including the founding fathers? They too were European immigrants. immigrants who drank heavily for many of the reasons you described. And this is from Michael.
Yes, many of our leaders were actually brewers, or everybody drank heavily, and it, people actually thought that alcohol was good for you, sort of like drinking medicine. And I don't know this, but I think that when life expectancy wasn't as great as it is today, if you were only expected to live to your maybe 40s or 50s, severe alcohol problems that cause death, like liver cirrhosis, may not have shown up. Also, I don't think that they were very diligent about collecting alcohol-involved deaths and developing statistics about it. So I think it kind of went unnoticed for a while, but definitely a lot of our leaders drank heavily also.
Okay. So here's another one. When you said revenue is higher under the control system versus a license system, do you mean revenue for the state? I imagine that businesses make less revenue under the control model. This is from Karen.
Okay, I don't know about the whether or not businesses make less money, and it would depend highly on the the situation. In Oregon, we had a contract that specified how much people would make via commission on alcohol sales. And, there were a lot of complaints that they didn't make enough money, but I think that's kind of typical of retailers. So I don't really know whether or not alcohol businesses make less money in control states than licensed states. I've never been asked that question, but it's an interesting consideration. As far as money for the state, each state does it a little bit differently, but the profit from the sale of alcohol was incorporated in Oregon state budget. We expected a certain level of profit, and then that profit was distributed according to a formula. Some of it went to alcohol issues, a lot of it went to local governments, and they argued that alcohol costs them a lot in terms of enforcement and managing community problems and that kind of thing. So the money definitely went to both state and local governments in Oregon, and in most states, I think it's kind of similar.
Okay. This one is more of an observation and a comment. It's from Skylar. He said, it's a perfect day for this webinar. It's the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 18th Amendment. So I'll just let you guys know it's divine timing. It wasn't intentional that it timed out that we were able to do this on today, but it was awesome that it is timed today. Here's another question. From Jennifer Jones, do you have references for statistics comparing control states to licensed states regarding issues such as DUI and accident rates and illnesses associated with alcohol use?
I suspect those things are available. I tend to not like those comparisons, and here's the reason why. Alcohol consumptions and alcohol problems are impacted by a lot of different factors. For example, in Utah, you have some of the lowest alcohol consumption rates and rates of underage drinking and things like that in the country. Well, that's heavily impacted by the Mormon population. The same is true in states like Tennessee, where Tennessee is in the Bible Belt, and there's a heavy involvement of religion as a a way to tamp down consumption. Weather. People tend to drink more, and there be more problems in northern climates. And now we have some research that associates weather conditions with alcohol consumption. Because there's so many factors impacting a state and its alcohol issues, I tend to want to steer people away from those kind of comparisons. I get them all the time. But MAD has a rating of states based on their policies and their incidence of DUI. I live in the Las Vegas area, which every morning you read about all the people who shot each other and all of the DUIs that killed people, sometimes kids on their way to school. It's really quite tragic. So that's a long, rambling response to your question.
Okay, we've got a few more, Pam. This one is from Denise, I believe that's how you say that. What are your recommendations for community organizations that are trying to keep alcohol state systems?
You know, I think that local coalitions have been remarkably successful in addressing alcohol issues. One of our great successes has been the reduction of underage drinking. I worked on underage drinking beginning in 1996, and every year rates went up, and we became really alarmed at the degree to which middle school kids were drinking it. Some of them weren't even teenagers. So it was very, very frightening. But eventually, those rates came down, and now we're experiencing some of the lowest rates of underage drinking in our history. And I think you can credit a lot of the work that was done by local coalitions. They brought together a lot of the stakeholders, held town halls, worked with schools, had various messaging campaigns. I am very, very supportive of local coalitions. I also like to encourage people to work with licensees, because my experience is that most licensees are good people and they want to abide by alcohol regulations. And one of the things that you can do to support the good licensee is to enforce your regulations fairly, particularly those that don't abide by regulations. So I think that's very important. But I really like coalitions. I participate with CADCA and their online chat room discussions a lot of the times. And I speak to various states and visit with local coalitions a lot, because I think they're really a kind of democracy at work. I hope that answered your question.
Okay. Okay, so we've got a couple more. Thank you. Somebody said thank you. So this again is from Skylar, which is a little off topic. He says, do you think that the federal prohibition on cannabis has been injurious to the implementation of a three-tiered system being applied to cannabis?
Um, uh, Boy, I don't even know where to start on this topic, Skylar. I'm very frightened by marijuana regulation. We unfortunately, I think that the mistake has been to go to full-blown commercialization of the product. We could have started with only allowing sales in control kind of situations like we do for alcohol, or only limited sales with a nonprofit. But But, it has become a money issue. States are rushing to garner the funding that can be gotten from legalizing the product, and some states are finding that the costs are also substantial and really limit the amount of revenue that can be gotten. The experience has been that the black market isn't going away. In fact, it's flourishing in many states. I just think we're very, very wrong-headed with regard to cannabis regulation, and I've written a couple of newsletter articles about it's, we're not regulating cannabis like alcohol, and I point out exactly why we haven't done that. Some states have tried to implement a three-tiered system. I think Washington technically has a three-tiered system, but it doesn't seem to work the same way with alcohol. So I don't know, but I really think that we need to reassess our approach to marijuana and first get out the facts, and use those facts to structure our regulations. But this is not exactly my area of expertise. I do watch it, but I'm not happy about what I see.
Okay. And so final question, Pam, we are a little bit over, so thank you for those who are hanging in. A final question from Michael again. Do you have any confirmation if prices actually are less in licensed states from control states, and if so, how much less?
I don't have that information compiled or at my fingertips. Certainly competition does tend to reduce prices and increase, and with reduced prices, you get increases in consumption. But I don't really have a hard and fast answer to your question.
Okay. Well, thank you all so very much for participating. If anybody thinks of any more questions, feel free to email me. I will forward them to Pam, and we will continue the conversation via email. So Pam, thank you for your time and for sharing your valuable knowledge with us. And thank you all for joining NABCA on this webinar. If anybody has questions that we did not address or thinks of something afterward, again, feel free to email me. Also, please visit the NABCA website, nabca.org, for various resources, including white papers, previous webinars, and other materials. We would like your feedback about this session and will soon be sending you a quick survey to complete. Also, let me know of suggestions for future webinars if you have them. It is our goal to give you the education and the tools you need to perform your function effectively. Wishing everyone a great day. Thank you all so much, and goodbye.